resources aren't exactly easy to come by right now.
Yeah.
Every team out there is stretched. And so you really need to have that priority decision making for your team. If we say you've got to do everything, they're going to fail at everything. As much as I would love to say you've got to do both at the same time, right? I do think it's really important as you're trying to do a lot of things to give that clarity.
All right, I have Rowan Tonkin here, CMO of Planful, at another episode of MasterSaaS Live. Rowan, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience here?
Yeah, firstly, thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it. As Arthur said, Rowan Tonkin, CMO at Planful. I've been at Planful for almost 4 years. Look after go-to-market strategy, the marketing department, and revenue operations, and led the company through a rebrand in my first 30 days on the job. So that's a story maybe for another episode. But so rebranded the company earlier on. Yeah.
Okay, that's amazing. Now, let's get into a fun one to start.
Sure.
I want you to maybe share what's the craziest marketing tactic that you've tried that maybe surprised you?
Yeah, I don't know if it was crazy, but when we did the rebrand, it was done in January of 2020. Not the most fun time to launch a rebrand. You're expecting to kind of overcome a lot of brand challenges,
Sure.
paid media and things like that.
Yeah.
And we didn't actually get to do a lot of that, right? As everything unfolded, putting our brand in front of our audience wasn't the appropriate thing to do. So following on from that, actually running a telemarketing campaign, which was just a simple phone call into our audience to say, hey, have you heard of Planful? And if you're in the market for financial performance management software, please consider Planful. Hang on. Right.
Wow.
Not booking a meeting, not anything, just a full brand awareness telemarketing campaign.
Yeah.
And it really helped us grow in the segments that we were looking to grow. And I think that's probably one of the ones where, I was talking to my CEO about it. I'm like, how are we going to know if this is working? The attribution on this is almost impossible.
Sure.
And so we ran that for about 18 months. And probably the craziest thing I've done in terms of long-term investment that I just really had a hard time measuring, and so it was one of those types of ones.
So were there any indicators there that you were like, hey, this is pretty good, to the point that you wanted to run it for 18 months?
Yeah, so brand traffic starts to go up, right? And that's something that we were looking for. Obviously, the traffic from the segments that we were calling was going up as well. Okay. And then you just start to see folks that where their first touch attribution, where their first touch was direct through website content, but they had a first touch that was a prior call. And so you started to see that happen over a longer period. So it wasn't completely blind, but it takes a while, right? Between and how often you cycle through that audience and those segments, right? It's not a complete pure play SDR cold outreach.
Sure.
So just getting that machine working took some time, but it was pretty interesting.
Now, let's switch focus to 2023, right? And I know a lot of companies, maybe for the first time ever, have started to look at their customers because based on macroeconomic conditions, the net new pie there's not as many people buying software out there. Let's say that. So on one side, I'm curious if this is something you're more focused on in terms of the customer marketing side, and I'd love for you to share maybe, one tactic that has been worked really well for you and the Planful team.
Our number one value as a company is customers. So we've always had a long-standing focus on our customers and how we serve them. And I think the investment or the strategy or tactic, if you will, that's really worked for us this year and we continue to do year over year is our user conference. We had that about 3 weeks ago in Chicago. That was the first time we've put it on fully virtual and fully on-premise at the same time.
Wow.
So every room was streaming live to over 1,500 folks at home, but also the 500 or so that attended. So that was an interesting challenge for the team, and we learnt a lot, and we're going to keep doing that year over year. So
very cool.
Yeah, that's probably something that I think was a really good investment, and it's an investment you have to make over a long period of time, because once you sign up to do a user conference, the expectation is you're going to do them every year, right?
Yeah, and let's talk about this, because I've heard you say it. I've heard Nick Mehta from Gainsight say Pulse has been incredible for them as a company. But I'm wondering, at what point do those scales start to tip where it's like, yes, this is a good investment? Because I imagine this is a long-term play, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
And you're not necessarily going to put on a user conference and see money flow in. A lot of the times I've heard you might even lose money on the first couple of years. So I'd love for you to maybe talk to some of the marketers there that might be thinking of it. What's been your experience?
I think if you're starting fresh and you haven't done a user conference, I would test doing a virtual kind of multi-day or a one-day, and just see the engagement that you get there before committing to a full on-premise. Or if you're already running user group strategies that are live and in person, start to think about, hey, can I make them maybe bigger but in less cities, right? So taking 15 or 20 user groups and consolidating them into 3 regional events, that type of thing.
That's great, yeah.
Test that. Like, can you get people to travel to your event? That's a hard thing right now. T&E is tight.
Sure.
If you're going to do it, make sure you're thinking about, how am I going to do this year over year? Because, as you said, it's not a short-term investment. And initially, it might not be upsell, cross-sell that are your key drivers initially. Sure. It might just be all about brand building and bringing community together. And so it might be brand perception that is your key metric. So it depends on where you are in your life cycle, but they'd be some tips that I'd say for folks exploring that.
I know traditionally there's 2 growth levers that marketing can pull on. And it seems a lot of the time it's typically brand awareness, demand generation, top of funnel. But I know there's this other lever that marketers are starting to focus on more, which is the conversion, right? Can we lift conversion rates within maybe certain stages of the sales cycle upwards of top of funnel? How are you viewing both of those levers? Are you trying to balance both? Is there one that you're focused on more than the other? I'd love for you to talk us through that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. When I think of those funnels, I think of them in audiences and regions. As I said, we sell to multiple audiences, and each funnel is different.
Yeah.
So I might be working really hard with one audience on just very top of funnel focus.
I see.
And with another audience in another region, our focus might be conversion rate optimization, because we know we've got the leads or we know we've got the pipeline.
Yeah.
It's like, how can sales and product marketing partner to convert that at a higher rate, right?
I see.
And so we look at it across the business, and it's in different pockets of our audience matrix to say, hey, like, we might be lacking in pipeline with this one business, so it's all about top of funnel. Let's not worry about conversion until we have all the leads, right?
Yeah.
On the other side, you might have created a big pipeline, and it's like, how can we bring this in faster to overcome any headwinds we're seeing with other audiences? I realize that's not easy if you sell to one audience in one market, right?
Sure.
That's one of the benefits of selling to multi-audiences in multi-markets, is you can start to maneuver around to get to the ultimate end result for the business, which is close one revenue.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, like, from what I'm hearing from you, Rowan, it almost sounds like you do have a scale, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, we're good on the pipeline. Now let's focus on conversion, which I think is a great way to look at it. Am I hearing that correctly? Where it's like you're looking at a certain number, or maybe pipeline coverage based on your funnel metrics of like, okay, now we feel good. Let's focus more on conversion.
Yeah, and as much as I would love to say you got to do both at the same time, right? Resources aren't exactly easy to come by right now.
Yeah.
Every team out there is stretched, and so you really need to have that priority decision making for your team. Look, if there's only one thing you could do today, work on this thing, right? And once you've done that, work on the next thing. Because unfortunately, our teams right now are so stretched. If we say you've got to do everything, they're going to fail at everything. You can't keep all those balls in the air. So yes, we do have a prioritization. I do want the team to work on everything, but I have to be clear about, where are those goals?
Yeah. I feel like I was listening to this recently where it's like only, I don't know, within the past 50 years have we pluralized priorities, right?
Yeah,
or it's just, what's your priority? It's one thing. And now it's like, what are your top 10 priorities?
Yeah.
It's like, ugh, how can I have some
and people bullet list them, right? And they're like, oh, well, is it implied that the top one is the top priority?
Yeah.
So numbered list them for your team. And that's hard to do, right?
Yeah.
As a leader, sometimes you're like, oh, well, they're the same priority. No, you have to be really clear. It's hard to do. It's sometimes you're a bit nervous about doing it because someone might get upset, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that was my top priority. It is, but someone else's is more important than that. And you have to deal with that. But I do think it's really important as you're trying to do a lot of things to give that clarity.
One question we like to ask marketing leaders like yourself is, if you were to go back on your career, is there a big mistake or a big lesson that you learned earlier on in your career that you could share with the audience?
Yeah, I'd say there's one that is consistent and one that like I always try and think through. So the first one that is consistent is not setting the right intentions with the team. It's like, oh, let's go and work on this thing. And it's like, there's never a goal behind it, or there's no clarity behind it. And, often we get into, oh, this is the fun thing that we want to go and do. And then we look back on it in 6-8 weeks or however long it takes. And we're like, that's not what we intended. And then you go, well, what did we intend? And there's nothing that tells you that, right? No one documented it.
Interesting.
There was no brief. There was no opportunity or problem statement behind it. There was no goals. There was no measures. And so I would say that's one that I'm always trying to like fight against.
Yeah.
Myself personally, because like, oh, I want to go work on this thing, and I don't take the time to like describe what the team needs, what resources we need, right? Like to go through the proper thing. I think the other one is, this is one that I always try and avoid, but it's really hard because it goes against all psychological behavior that you have. Often we come up with stuff and we're so committed to it that we're consistent with it. And that could be like brand positioning or design or something like that. And you never stop and say, is it working, right? And so I've done brand positioning before, and it didn't work. It didn't land. People weren't receiving it, but we were too slow to be self-critical enough.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something like when you're working on something big, be hypercritical of yourself sometimes, like take that step back and say, hey, is this actually working? And be quick to shut it down if it's not. And often, we're all in marketing because we're very persuasive people.
Yeah.
We persuade ourselves.
Sure, yeah.
And sometimes that's really hard to stop persuading yourself to say, actually, no, that wasn't the right decision. I need to go back on it. And that's hard because you're putting the team through a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's not easy to say that to yourself. Hey, I made the wrong decision.
Yeah.
But I definitely think that that's something that I would teach myself earlier in my career, is to be that self-critical, because often I was like so committed to my idea or the thing that I never stopped and said, is it actually working? And then redid it. And so you'd be letting something go for too long, and it shouldn't have gone for that long. Yeah.
It's fantastic advice. It's resonating probably more than it should a little bit right now. So I'm going to take a hard look
at later. Yeah.
Take a hard look in the mirror. Now, this was great because I think it lends itself to you're taking a look back and where you could be more critical, maybe to those marketers that aren't VPs of marketing, that aren't CMOs, and they're thinking, man, I would love to level up to that extent. What advice would you give them? Is it a certain skill sets? How are you thinking about the marketers that want to achieve that career growth?
Yeah.
Any advice or tips that you have for them?
Yeah, we have some core behaviors that we have documented in the Planful way. It's our kind of internal culture book. And the two that I really love are intention and progress. And so the first one of intention I've already talked through, right? So what I see high performers do is they write down, hey, I'm going to achieve X by Y, and this is what I do. And then they communicate that well with their stakeholders, whether that's a peer or their boss or whoever. And so they get the team aligned, and then they're really good at making progress on that. So I would say to folks out there, what that means to me is like, set your goals, go after them, and then be mindful to check in and say, am I achieving them, right? And no matter what role you're doing, your boss is going to love you for that. Because they're going to say, hey, this person is working on A, B, and C. I know that because they've told me, number one. I see their goals. Do I agree with them? Well, likely if I'm going to let them do all that work, I do, right?
Sure,
And then if you indicate progress, then the boss is like, I'm informed. I understand what they're working on. It's the right stuff. And so it's really hard to go wrong when you're not sharing that information or you haven't defined it, yet you're just doing busy work.
Yeah.
People are like, what does that person do? I'm not sure. And so the top performers I've worked with, they have a natural inclination to do that.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have that natural inclination, find some habits that help you get in there. And I'm someone who is very unstructured. My team don't love me for that, but I therefore know I need to create structure because other people need it. And so I've talked a lot today about structure.
Yeah.
But that's because I don't need it myself personally, but the team need it to succeed. And so I've got to create it for them, even though it's not where I like to live naturally.